Okay, it's time for episode 4, and as always, Chucky here from the forums, and we've also got Jigsaw.
How you guys doing?
I'll answer for them. They're doing okay.
Okay. Well, how are you doing, Chucky?
I'm very tired. For those who listen to the show, which may only be 2-3 people at best, and hopefully a lot more in the future, I do live in Australia, and we record this show roughly at about 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on a Friday, which for me translates to about 9 a.m., which isn't that early, but for someone who tends to not go to bed so early, I am quite tired when I wake up. Aside from that, I'm doing very well. And how are you today?
I'm just delightful.
That's lovely. As usual, we've got 5 main movies to discuss. The first one is Maniac Cop from 1988. Basically an undead zombie cop back for revenge. Drive, which is a more recent movie featuring Ryan Gosling. We've got Subspecies, an early 90s vampire movie. And we've got the original It. We all know the clown Pennywise who's terrorizing children everywhere. And then we've also got the Blob, this thing from outer space that just keeps growing and eats people.
And it's the 88 remake, not the superior 58 version.
Ooh, superior. Ooh.
That's throwing some heat.
Okay.
First movie up we have what's often considered a classic, or at least a cult classic, the 1988 Maniac Cop. Plot's pretty interesting. There's a serial killer going around New York, killing seemingly innocent people. Catch is, the serial killer is a uniformed police officer, or seems to be a uniformed police officer. This one investigator is investigating this, trying to figure out who's doing these crimes. They run into a young police officer who seems suspect, named Jack, who is played by Bruce Campbell of the Evil Dead fame. And they suspect for a brief moment he may be the murderer, but they dig more into it and we find out more things about why these murders are being committed and who's doing them. And it's sort of like a slasher with some potentially, depending on how you take it, potentially supernatural undertones. Is it a zombie? Is it just a messed up guy? Not sure. But it's a very interesting movie. There's not many movies out there which have police be the main antagonists, at least many horror movies. So it brings a little something interesting to the genre, and in the late 80s we sort of needed something interesting because by that point many of the slashers coming out were somewhat derivative and generic, which you could probably say was true from the early 80s, but I digress. Maniac Cop is a pretty decent movie. It's not necessarily amazing, but it does have, I think, enough to keep you entertained, especially since you have both Bruce Campbell and, in my opinion, the more impressive Tom Atkins, who you may know from Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, or The Fog, Night of the Creeps, a lot of horror classics. So, you have a pretty good cast, pretty interesting story, some decent kills throughout the movie. So, it's an interesting backstory on the antagonist.
Yeah. This is definitely a favorite of mine. I've watched it so many times, and I used to watch it a lot when I was very young. I do remember whenever I used to go to the video store, and this is a movie where it does have some action aspect to it, so it's kind of a horror action movie, but I think it's still more a horror than anything else, but at the video store, it would commonly be in the action
Nice.
section. Yeah. And I guess the reason why I bring that up is because I'm not sure what the VHS looked like in America, but over here, on the back of the VHS, it actually has a really bloody image on the back. There's a scene where I think it's like a motel maid walks in and finds a lady with her throat cut, and in the movie it happens very quickly, like they cut to kind of the bloody body on the bed, and it doesn't quite have as much impact as it does seeing the image on the back, because on the image on the back of the VHS is kind of zoomed out, so you see both the lady screaming at this body that's just got blood everywhere. I don't know, it's just one of those unsuspecting, creepy, scary type images, at least when you're a child, to see that that was pretty intense in itself. As for the movie, I really enjoy pretty much everything throughout. It doesn't really have any boring moments. It starts off fairly quickly. We get the scenes with the Maniac Cop himself killing people. I don't know how often, but he seems to be killing someone every 5 minutes during the movie, at least for a while.
He is pretty prolific, yes.
I can't see how too many people would be bored as they actually watch this movie, because there is quite a lot of thrilling things happening most of the time. And you've got Bruce Campbell, who, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of The Evil Dead. I think they're okay movies, so I'm not as huge of a Bruce Campbell fan as maybe some other people are. He does fine in the movie, but his name itself being in the movie doesn't move the needle much for me at all. I think Robert Z'Dar, who plays the Maniac Cop, because of his weirdly shaped head, he's got this huge head with this huge chin, he does bring a certain unique flavor to quite a prolific character. There is a moment during the movie where, and it's actually a pretty good moment, where people are out there saying they can't trust the cops, and because it's a cop out there that's killing everyone, and we get that one scene where a lady shoots a cop by accident, and that's probably one area where they could have used it beyond just that one scene. They kind of talk about it, and that one scene happens, and then we don't really hear too much more about how civilians interact with cops.
Yeah, it seems to me that once the news report comes out, like you say, we get just a single scene or so, and then from that point on, it's just focused purely on the police point of view, and we don't really see any more, mistaken identity or any interaction. So, yeah, it's sort of like lost potential.
Yeah, they could have used that a little more.
I mean, I do think it's interesting from a modern day point of view. I'm not going to pretend I know how things are over in Australia, but in certain communities in the US, there's a lot of distrust towards police. And I'm sure that distrust existed back in the late 80s too. I'm sure it's existed for a long time in some communities. So, sort of taking that distrust and sort of molding it into, making a antagonist, a policeman, who is theoretically supposed to be one of the more respected professions. If you choose to look at it, there's a decent amount of commentary there.
Well, yeah, probably not to the same degree here, but it does still happen here as well. You've got people who... you get a lot of people who get pulled over for speeding, and they go, why don't you catch some real criminals,
I sort of like your Australian impression, despite being Australian. It's amusing. Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's definitely an interesting idea, and it's not actually... This movie had two sequels, but there's actually a sort of ripoff called Psycho Cop in '89, which is of much lower quality. But on a side note, if that's another one I would sort of recommend to anybody who's interested in, this idea. That movie's a lot more lighthearted. It's not necessarily a comedy, but it's definitely not taken as seriously as this one is. For this movie, I had a few issues, nothing terribly major. I wish they did more with Tom Atkins' character than they did. It seemed he was a really important character for a lot of the movie, and then something happens and he's not nearly as important. Which didn't even, to me, it sort of felt, it was satisfying in a way, but at the same time, I just wanted them to do more with him, because he was probably my favorite character in the movie. Also, I sort of thought it was funny how Bruce Campbell, comes into the whole situation because his wife was found dead in a hotel, and then pretty much from that point on, he doesn't mention his wife or Alan's just hanging out with the chick he was cheating on her with, which it's a kick in the face to the deceased.
I suppose so, but I guess at the same time, they were pretty much on the verge of divorce. Just out of interest, when you watch this movie, and I don't know if you actually watched it very recently or if you're just going off the last time you watched it, but there are two different versions of this movie. There's the regular, I guess, theatrical type cut, and then there's also, I think it's referred to as being a Japanese television cut. Now, see, I've got both a Blu-ray and a DVD, which have two different versions, and the TV cut actually has a lot more added footage of a new character who actually doesn't appear at all in the theatrical cut, like a mayor of the city. Did you watch that one?
Well, so to give some context, once we found out which movies we were discussing, I ordered 2 of them on DVD, one being Maniac Cop, the other being The Blob. So I got the DVDs of both movies because it's the easiest way for me to watch them. So after I had read your review, I double checked which one I watched, and it seems that I did watch the shorter 83-minute version. So I may have missed out on some of the interesting additions that you may have seen.
The scenes themselves, they're not that special, but it does... I don't know how many extra scenes it is. It's an extra 3 or 4 scenes, of which each scene goes for probably a couple of minutes. And they do have this mayor character who is kind of a prick, and I think he was also a part of whatever group that framed Cordell, the Maniac Cop, which, as we know, eventually led to him going to jail and getting killed.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Was it a frame? I mean, to me it seems like the cop had a history of abusing potential, people who committed crime. To me it seemed like they were covering up, and then once some new people got into power, then they unleashed it, and then he got thrown into jail. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if frame is the right word, but they definitely wanted him away. I can't off the top of my head remember why. I think it's just because it's because the politicians themselves have some dirty hands, and Cordell was getting close to busting some of them, I guess.
Nice.
Yeah. So they did kind of, in a way, whether you want to use the word framed or not, they were responsible for him ultimately going to jail and getting murdered in jail, as we know.
So I'm reading about the scenes right now, and I'm definitely going to try to find these later just to throw in a little more context for me. For anybody who doesn't know, and I suspect most people may not care, I always take an interest in politics, so any movie that throws in some politics has me.
I guess the most interesting thing with these extra scenes is that it does come with an additional ending scene just before the credits, which is mostly kind of like an off-camera type kill scene, but for me it's actually quite effective. I quite enjoy those extra scenes themselves, even though I can live without them as well. I think the movie is slightly better with them. And you can tell that these scenes were filmed, I guess, separately from the movie, or at least without any of the other cast being involved. So these extra scenes purely just have this mayor character and some other throw-in character, I think, for the most part. If I had to take one version over the other, I would probably take the version with the extra scenes.
I will say, I will look into that sometime after the show. I did think the more somewhat stylistic, during the St. Patrick's Day scene where these 2 characters are killed and we just see it sort of behind a shaded door, I thought that was, if anything, it was pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think the scene that stands out to me the most is in the police station where he kills the lady with the bum leg, the one that he had a relationship with.
And of course there was that one character getting thrown out the window, which is probably one of the, maybe not necessarily shocking kills, but I can imagine it taking some people, such as myself, by surprise. Because I actually had seen this movie before, but it had been something like 5-6 years, and having not seen it in that long, coming back to it, it's amazing how much of the little things you can just completely forget. I pretty much only remembered maybe 2 things about the movie, and that was it. I think Maniac Cop is a pretty decent movie. It's not really... I used to like it, I feel, a little more than I do now. It's still a really good movie. It's a slasher fun. I think the movie has a decent amount to offer, some decent characters. I mean, who doesn't like Tom Atkins? It's a movie that doesn't have as much to it as you might hope it does. It does have a pretty interesting story, but at the same time, there are just some small things I wish they either tweaked up a little. Like Chucky said, it might help if you see the extended version, just to add a little more detail. So, if you have a choice, I'd go for that one. I would probably give Maniac Cop around an 8 out of 10. So definitely an above average movie, but it's not really my top tier of 80s slashers.
Maniac Cop for me is one of my favorite movies, but it's not a perfect movie for me. So, with that being said, I give it a 9 out of 10. The character of Cordell is quite interesting, and because they provide that kind of emotional touch to it, he is a bad guy, but he's also a good guy. So having those two sides to the character definitely makes for something a little more unique than your typical bad guy out there slashing people.
I would say the flashback they threw in was, in my opinion, really effective for Cordell.
And the music that they've got for the movie, especially during that scene and some other scenes, stands out quite well on its own. I don't know how familiar you are with the sequels, but I know some people really enjoy Part 2 more than they enjoy Part 1. I enjoy Part 2 just as much as the original, but neither more or less.
I've never actually seen either of the sequels as of yet.
We'll have to discuss those in the future. So next up, we've got Drive. It's about a man who I guess I'll refer to as the driver, as he doesn't really get a name in the movie. He works as a mechanic and also as a Hollywood stuntman in his part-time. He slowly develops a relationship with his neighbor and their child, and then eventually he finds out that his neighbor has a partner who has been away or has just come back from prison, and he's still being chased by some bad guys. So the driver agrees to participate in a heist, which goes wrong and upsets some, I guess, unsavory mob-type characters who are then out to kill the driver and his acquaintances, if that's what you want to call them. I think this is a movie with some really great acting and some great actors. It doesn't have as much dialogue, at least not with its main character, or some of its main characters, but it does quite a good job of conveying emotion without so many words. And a part of that is also with the soundtrack. The soundtrack, which consists of mostly songs that I would never normally listen to just based on the songs themselves, but it's one of those movies where the song and the movie combined somehow makes, the music of the song stand out even more than they would on their own. There are a few scenes of surprising violence at times, so it's a movie where at times, you've got this romantic moment and then it transitions into some sadistic violent moment. Yeah, it's a little bit of a roller coaster, but not quite as action-packed as some may expect with a movie called Drive and about a man who's a getaway driver. I know you've only just recently watched this for the first time. What did you think about it?
Yeah, so to give some context, I didn't really know much about this movie going in. I know that when this came out back in 2011, it was given the cast, it was a decently popular movie and pretty high rated. I don't focus on non-horror movies all that often, so I completely went past me. I thought it was a decent movie. I thought the opening scene was fantastic, and about one of the only times we get to really see him do some getaway driving stuff, but that's okay. I think Ryan Gosling is a pretty good actor here. There's like you say, there's a lot of non-verbal communication between him and the lead woman actress whose name I completely forget right now. But they have a very interesting non-verbal communication style. And sometimes it feels a bit awkward because it's just seconds and seconds of no one talking, occasionally looking at each other, Ryan Gosling doing his stupid little smile. But but yeah, it's still a pretty decent movie. There's some parts I feel like a movie is a bit anticlimactic, to be honest. I was sort of hoping they would go in a quote-unquote more epic direction, but at the same time, Drive really isn't the type of movie that would do that. I did really enjoy the sort of almost 80s feel of the aesthetics. Not sure much the cinematography, but the music, like Chucky alludes to, is a very retro 80s type music. And I actually do listen to that type of music. Well, I listen to a lot of types of music, but I do listen to that type of music on occasion. So it's always nice to hear it make into big budget movies. And some of the songs are really catchy too. And perhaps for me, what stands out the most, aside from the interesting story, is the main character himself. We never really, ironically, learn what drives him. So, okay. So, we never
You
really
just
know.
had to. You just had to get that
I know.
in there, didn't you? You had that written down somewhere, didn't you?
I'm just a witty guy. I think it's interesting though, because I was sort of expecting some type of backstory on the guy, and we never really got any whatsoever. I mean, we don't even get the guy's name. So, a very interesting character. I think the opening sequence shows what a cool collector guy he is, and I actually really enjoyed the opening sequence. It didn't necessarily go downhill from there, but I do think the opening gave me the idea that the movie was going to be something it wasn't. The violent scenes Chucky spoke of, some of them were really good, since it's a slow motion shotgun to the face. That was a fantastic scene. I actually rewinded that and watched it again because I was just sitting and it's like, oh hey, that's really well done. And when they do go into an action-packed sequence, it's usually pretty good stuff. It doesn't happen that often, but it's pretty decent. You know, I enjoyed the movie. There's a few things I would tweak a bit on. As much as I appreciate where they're going for, some of the awkward silences can be a bit much, but I can certainly see why this got quite a bit of acclaim when it came out.
Well, I think the lack of backstory for the main character, in some cases, that's usually a bad thing. In this case, I think it adds, or it just makes him more badass, I guess you could say. The fact that you know just so very little, almost nothing about him. You don't even know his name. Don't know where he came from. The movie has been responsible for a few memes as well. The Real Human Being song, which I think is mostly towards the end. Oh, actually, they play a song earlier and then towards the end as well. But yeah, if you're a fan of memes, just type in Real Human Being, BEAN. You'll see a lot of funny clips, especially one from the movie The Room. You know, that really bad movie, the so bad it's good type movie. There's a scene where they've got this song spliced into that, which actually works out really well.
I can only imagine that is a cheat. I think just needs to be pointed out. Now, you may or may not be a Ryan Gosling fan. I've not seen many movies with him, aside from a movie I enjoyed with Anthony Hopkins, named Fracture from 2007. So I knew the actor going in. The movie also has a Bryan Cranston, though, of Breaking Bad fame, in more than a few scenes. And Ron Perlman, who I suspect most people would recognize the name, even if they don't know him from anything. Off the top of my head, I'm hard pressed to say any movies he was in. I think, was he in Hellboy? I don't even know. But he has a very recognizable face, and admittedly, I didn't care much for his character, but the movie itself is a pretty decent cast. So if this story sounds like it might not be your type of thing, at least if some of the cast members sound interesting, it might be worth checking out.
I quite like Fracture. I actually saw that in the theaters, and that's a good thriller. Another movie that Ryan Gosling's in, which is actually from the same director as this movie, called Only God Forgives, which in some aspects has some similarities with probably even less dialogue than this movie has. And it's a movie that's split. You know, people who enjoy Drive, they're quite split on that movie, Only God Forgives. Some people still like it, some people hate it, and maybe we'll have to talk about that one in the near future, because that's actually a lot more of a definitely a darker movie than what Drive is.
Yeah, I will say though, despite Drive not being necessarily dark, there were quite a few really well done scenes. I really, it's sort of a low key scene, but when he's driving with the woman and her son, and sort of taking them to the small place near the creek, it's sort of just a nice little scene with the music playing, and sort of showing the first time he really feels connected, I'm assuming, to people in quite some time. So I did appreciate a lot of the things in this movie, some of the small things. So even though there were some issues, you know, even the ending was decent. The ending of it was anticlimactic, but the last few minutes were pretty okay.
Yeah, well, I actually rather liked the movie. The first time I saw it, I was a little confused with it, wasn't sure what to think about it, but it's a movie that every time that I watch it since, I just enjoy it more and more. I appreciate it more and more. You start to pick up on the more subtle things throughout the movie, especially the scenes where there's not a whole lot of dialogue. So I give the movie a 9 out of 10. It's got good acting, soundtrack blends in really well with the movie itself and what they're going for, and it's a good story. Very simple story, but still a very good story in how it all unfolds on the screen.
Yeah, I think there's a lot about Drive to like. There's some solid actors, there's some great scenes. If you're more into the action, there's some great action when it goes that route. Some, like I said, some fantastic violence. Like the slow motion shotgun scene, that's a really solid scene. So, there's certainly a lot of things to like. I'm not totally convinced I loved the movie, but it's not one I'm going to be forgetting anytime soon. And I can imagine if I happen to watch it again in the future, it's a movie that would probably still impress me. I'll probably lean towards giving this one, I would say maybe a 7.5, rounded up to an 8. I mean, it's definitely an above average movie. It's a movie I was impressed with, but there's some aspects I didn't entirely love. Even, that said, it's still a movie. Assuming awkward dialogue scenes, don't throw you off, it's a movie I would definitely recommend looking into. Assuming you haven't already, because I suspect most people have already heard about the movie, and I'm just way behind on the times, but I'm okay with that.
And you're a real human being.
Next up is the 1991 cult classic, Subspecies. And this is a movie that spawned a series of movies that, well, it's a small amount of people. I've seen a lot of love for these movies online. And of course, with many Full Moon Entertainment movies who also brought us the Puppet Master movies. Though somewhat lower quality, but they have a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of them have some decent feeling in them. For Subspecies, sort of an interesting story. Two students from America meet up with a friend of theirs in Transylvania, Romania, and they are trying to work on the thesis together. At the same time, this sort of evil vampire has recently killed his father, the king vampire, and is trying to take over the power of the Bloodstone, which I guess is the most powerful artifact vampires can have. He's a very violent individual, unlike his father, who sort of had a truce with humans. He is a much more aggressive, attack human type guy. At the same time, this guy, whose name is Radu, has a brother who is half human, half vampire, who learns about this and tries to stop him. At the same time, he falls in love with one of the 3 human kids who came over from the US. So, sort of a little romance going in there. And the movie's basically just following these 3 girls, the things that happen to them, and that's pretty much it. There's a lot of interesting things in the movie. From my understanding, it's one of the earliest American movies to be actually formed in Romania following the fall of the USSR. Because of that, it's a very interesting, very authentic vibe to the movie, which I suspect some people may overlook or they may not care about. I thought it brought a very interesting feel to it, especially when they're being, chased through the dark wards or they're just lounging outside this medieval castle. I don't know, there's a lot of almost history in the movie. So while some of the story elements, such as the god vampire fighting the evil brother vampire, may not necessarily work out, if you can look past the story and just look at the forest, you'll have a fun time. Which might be one of the lamest ways to promote a movie.
Yeah, the setting for the movie is good. It's got a very unique look, very unique feel. For me personally, and I know you're not a huge fan of vampire movies, and I'm probably even further from being a fan of vampire movies. I can really only think of 2 that I enjoy off the top of my head, which is the original Fright Night and Near Dark, and they're both, I'd call them unconventional vampire movies. They're quite far from what a traditional vampire movie would be like. And so for me, Subspecies, it's a movie where I'm not really that interested in the story. I think most of the characters quite dull and boring to me. Like, I just didn't really care about any of the women that were in the movie. Obviously, Radu's quite an interesting character, but outside of him, there's not a whole lot of characters in the movie that I cared to see on the screen. Maybe his half-brother, just a little bit. There's something interesting there.
I did like the old guy. I forget the guy who played him, but he was so fun.
You mean the old guy throughout the movie, or at the start of the movie?
No, the like the sort of sidekick to the half.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So yeah, I was going to say, well, I'm sure you knew Angus Scrimm.
Yes,
so.
yes.
who wears a pretty ridiculous wig, by the way.
I think it's pretty fashionable, but
Kind of made me think of those, what are they, like, Supreme Court judges or whatever? I don't know what they're called. Not Supreme Court, I can't remember the name of them, but they wear those wigs, and kind of made me think of those.
yeah, it may not be his finest role, but that's okay.
I mean, I should mention that my wife is completely obsessed with this series. So I've gone to bed many nights while listening to these movies playing, and I've woken up many nights to her asleep on the couch with the DVD menu on loop with that goddamn theme music just playing over and over and over again. And I mean, the theme music itself is fine, but just I've heard it so much. I'm not sure if you're aware, but they are actually making a new Subspecies.
Are they really?
Yeah, it's I think it's due to come out February next year. They announced it a couple months ago.
That is interesting.
Yeah, but I think they're still getting is it Anders Hove or Hove? I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I believe he's returning as Radu.
I suspect I've never seen any of the other Subspecies movies, so maybe you can correct me. Is that vampire Radu, is he the only recurring character?
To be honest, I never pay too much attention to the movies
Okay.
when my wife's playing them, but he's the only main bad guy that stands out to me. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I will say, well, some elements of the story did do it for me. I really did like Radu's design. I thought it was a very sort of Count Olaf, Nosferatu type vampire design, and I appreciate that, especially the really long fingers and fingernails. So, I always enjoy it when vampires veer away from the Bela Lugosi classy feel, more into the grotesque, subhuman feel that went for.
I'm not so much sure if it's more apparent in the sequels, because I did review the second movie at some point a while back, and I made a point about how Radu sounds like he's auditioning for a role in The Godfather. the way he speaks, and at some point in the movie, I'm kind of expecting him to just randomly blurt out something like, "What did I do to deserve this flat, flavorless Manhattan?" I don't know. He's an interesting character, but one that I kind of make a little fun of on the side as well. There was one scene in the movie, though, that I guess stood out, outside of the opening scene, which is fine. I can't remember the scene where they're having some sort of party. The scene where he pops up behind the mask.
Yeah, it's like a festival of the undead type thing.
Yeah, the festival, yeah, that's it. That scene was good, but there's very few scenes in the movie that really stood out to me.
I also sort of enjoyed when it used, when he was being chased away by some characters, his shadow sort of shrink behind him, which, I don't know, it just had a very sort of almost classic horror feel to it. Although, I don't even know what you would call them, like the demon-looking minions he creates at the beginning of the movie. I'm not entirely convinced about those particular facts, so I think it was, I forget how they did that, but they didn't necessarily look great. And honestly, they also seem sort of pointless in my opinion, but that's just a small thing I noticed when watching it.
At times they look okay, like when they're doing a very close-up of maybe one of them, and then when they're trying to put multiple on the screen at once, it's... You can see that they're just kind of layered over the image, so it almost feels like you're watching a really bad 3D movie, or... just in those moments where they are on the screen, and, they just look like they've been stuck to the TV rather than actually in the actual scene itself. At times, those things look good, and sometimes they look really terrible.
I guess on the upside, there was a decent decapitation toward the end. Even though I didn't necessarily care for the story, the finale itself was somewhat action-packed. Although, the more I think about it, I'm sort of rethinking my rating on the movie.
Well, now's the time to try and get your rating right.
Indeed. Now, this is a movie I've seen before, and it didn't do much for me when I first saw it. I thought it was okay, but much like Chucky, I just didn't care about the story that much. I watched this about, 2 days ago, and at the time I'm like, well, this is actually pretty decent. No, I didn't necessarily love it, but it was decent. Watching it again, I gave it initially an 8 out of 10. I think when you change it to a 7.5, I'm going to round that up to an 8, but I still think it's an above average movie. but I don't think it's quite as good as I thought it was when I saw it just a few days ago. Biggest issue being, there's just some story elements I don't care for, and while there's a lot of interesting cinematography design choices, and I really can't overstate how unique the Romanian feel, at least to me, it just really adds a lot to the movie. If this had taken place in like suburban America, I can't imagine this getting over a 5 from me. But the fact that they filmed this in Romania just really brings something that it otherwise wouldn't have had. So I'll probably give this a 7.5, rounded up to an 8. Still an above average movie, just not quite amazing.
I didn't quite so much have a great time with it. I give it a 4 out of 10.
I can just hear your wife screaming.
Yeah, she's like banging on the door and gonna kick it down. It's like, you change your fucking reading. But no, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of vampire movies, and this is certainly one that doesn't stand out as being a good vampire movie to me. Radu's a decent character, but outside of him, there's not a whole lot going for it, just for my taste. So moving on to It, the original 1990 TV miniseries. And even though it is a miniseries, I think it's fine to just refer to it as a movie. The story revolves around a predatory shape-shifting demon which has the ability to transform itself into its people's worst fears. It mostly takes the human form of a sadistic wisecracking clown called Pennywise.
Is your refrigerator running? It is!
Well, those jokes were funny back then. Yeah, so a group of outcast kids known as the Lucky Seven, or if you're a bully, they're referred to as the Losers Club. They discover Pennywise and vow to kill him by any means necessary. This is in 2 parts. So the first part takes place while these main characters are children, back in the 60s, and the second part shows them returning as adults to finally defeat the evil clown Pennywise once and for all. So I guess I should start off by saying that this is in my top 3 of all time. Like I said, I'm going to refer to it as a movie, even though it's a miniseries. It's a movie that scared a lot of people back when it came out. If you were a child watching this back when it was new, and I'm guessing you didn't see it in the 90s, but I remember talking to other people who said they were afraid of going near pipes and any kind of drains or anything like that. So it's a movie that now to people probably comes off as very cheesy and corny, whatever you want to call it. But back then, especially as a child, it's something that really got to me. And because of that, I don't know if I want to use the word traumatized, but it's a movie that even to this day, when I hear certain scenes with the music and some of the Pennywise sightings, especially in the first half, really still give me goosebumps. And that's obviously, it's based on my time watching it as a child. So I think overall it's acted fairly decently, even though the second half does turn into a bit of a TV soap drama and loses a bit of its horror aspect. Tim Curry puts in one of the best performances, I think, that you'll see for a horror character, horror personality. And despite the second half not being anywhere near as good as the first half, I still think overall it's a fantastic movie.
So, this is a movie that there's so much to talk about when it comes to this one. Now, I was born 1993, so I was, 3 years late to missing the premiere. I still saw this when I was a kid. I saw this so many times. My parents really liked this, so we had like an old VHS copy, and if we didn't, we always got it out from the VHS store. That's the 2 VHS tapes, part 1, part 2. So when I was a kid, I saw this movie so many times. It's actually probably one of the first horror movies, non-black and white horror movies I saw growing up. It's probably, I know I saw it before Nightmare on Elm Street. And another influential movie when I was growing up was actually another Stephen King adaptation titled The Night Fly from 1997, which actually is a vampire movie. But since I saw that one as a kid, that one also really freaked me out. This one terrified me. The whole Pennywise, it just terrified me. The music, fantastic music. It's a very creepy, carnival-like feel. The opening sequence, which a young, girl gets I mean, it's out of screen, it's a television production, but just gets massacred by this just creepy clown behind waving sheets, laundry hanging up. There's so many things in this movie that I remember when I saw as a kid that just freaked me out. The whole shower scene with Adi Kasbrak. It doesn't necessarily look good today, but it's such a creepy concept. Just that gloved hand popping out of the drain pipe. I mean, there's just so many things. At the same time, watching it nowadays, and being a giant fan of the book, which I've read so many times. I try to read it once a year since I was back in middle school. There's so many things this leaves out that I just can't help but take notice of. And obviously this movie means a lot to a lot of people who grew up in that time. So if people enjoy this movie, that's great. And I still, by and large, I really enjoy the movie. But there's just so many things, despite even a really long running time, that they could do. Or maybe they did have the money to do, or they just couldn't throw in. That would have really benefited this. All this said, I still think it's a pretty decent television production. If you happen to see it when you're a kid, you're probably never going to forget it. If you happen to be an adult tuning in to what happened 30 years ago, it may not have much of an impact. But it is a fantastic performance by Tim Curry. Some really creepy things, and definitely one that shaped my love for the horror genre.
Just listening to you describing them, especially the earlier scenes, like the laundry sheets, and I was just getting goosebumps just then thinking about it. I mean, what a way to open. I think it's a movie that only takes 10 seconds to start giving me the hairs on my arms start raising, and just seeing the title with the music behind it. I don't know. It's still to this day gets to me.
And also the way the movie, and the book did the same thing. The way the movie goes, it starts up in present day, and then you slowly learn the story through flashbacks of the main characters after they get mysterious phone calls. I think it's just a fantastic idea, and I think, despite them missing something, I think they did a really good job with this one. And that's one thing I had with the remake, because of the way they just focused on the early day stuff. Because of that, they're not really going to be able to do this whole flashback thing. I thought this version did so well, but I guess that's a discussion for a later time.
I mean, you were mentioning earlier that it's left out so many things from the novel, and I guess I should state, and anyone who's watched our show before will know that I don't read novels. I just don't have the attention span to kind of just sit down and spend so much time reading. So I'm purely looking at this from just being a movie and not how it's been translated from the book.
Yeah, it's difficult, because I obviously saw this movie long before I read the book. And then when I finally read the book, because that's, again, one of my father's, it's a book he went back to so often. So I read the book at a somewhat young age, and even reading the book, I mean, you think watching the movie terrifies you, just reading the book, when I was like 10, 11 years old, it terrified the shit out of me. I mean, it doesn't matter if you go book or movie, it's just going to terrify you if you're young. So it's really hard to get away from the very nostalgic feelings I have even when watching it. I'm sure Chuck has seen this movie a lot, and I know I've seen it so many times. It's just such a nostalgic feeling when watching it. But at the same time, it can't get out of my head. Well, it would have been really cool if they did this, or maybe if they changed some of the really corny dialogue in the second half. I mean, and that's not to say that the second half is terrible. There's a lot of decent things in it. In fact, I even like the opening where present-day Bill Danborough sees Pennywise dig in a grave, in the graveyard. Just sort of a creepy little scene. I don't know, there's a lot to like about it, but trying to break away from what I know after reading the books is somewhat difficult.
Well, with part 2 not being quite as good, I guess the great thing about it is that even though, on the DVD and Blu-ray versions have kind of spliced it all together as one movie, if you do have either the original VHS in 2 parts or the original television recording in 2 parts, they actually do play the credits after the first part. So you could even just stop it right there and treat that first part as just the movie itself. And that also, the ending of part 1 has a scene, the suicide scene, which really gets to me as well.
Yeah, I thought the way they did that was pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
Just a really slow building up music in the background, and then when she finally sees it, it's a fantastic conclusion. I mean, you can buy your ass after people saw that on TV. They came back the next night.
Oh yeah, definitely. The scream she lets go at the end with it on the wall, and yeah, that definitely gets to me. Yeah. One other thing I thought I'd mention is that, and I'm not sure what it was like for the VHS over there, but the VHS that I used to rent and watch actually had some things cut out. I guess maybe because it was too long to put everything on one VHS, I'm not sure, but they did just trim a few parts of the movie. One noticeable part was they trimmed out Georgie going into the basement to get the glue or whatever you call that stuff, even though that's a very short scene.
I'm thinking about it saves like 5 seconds.
Well, it might be 30 seconds, I'm not sure, but then they would also trim sometimes like the last 20 seconds of each flashback in part 1. Yeah, so I don't know, just when I got the DVD, I started seeing all these little extra bits and pieces, which got me excited. So, and I know the DVD itself still doesn't have everything that the TV version had, because I believe it was in the second part. There is a scene where they're leaving the hotel. There's some extra footage there. Nothing too special, but just something extra. And if you haven't seen that, you can always go on YouTube. I'm sure it's on there. Another thing is, a long time ago, I did create... I don't know how big trolling was, but I did upload a scene from it where I took the Ben flashback scene from part 1, where he's getting the phone call from Mike asking him to come back, and I've put this video up on YouTube where he just says, no, I'm not coming back, and then he goes back to banging his lady friend.
I don't know. I will say, I mean, there's so many things I could talk about. I just really enjoyed how he had he was just living in like this really large complex. I don't know. His living style is really interesting to me. And that's a completely different opening to Bond's character than what we got from the books. And, I sort of appreciated that change. So, there's one thing I actually wanted to mention, and this may not interest Chucky necessarily, but one of the most interesting changes from the books to this miniseries was that in the books, once everybody got back to Derry, all of them were 100% committed to defeating and killing Pennywise. Whereas in the miniseries, I mean, they're about to leave Derry when Bill finally says, hey, help me, guys, help me. And then they finally say, okay, well, yeah, I guess we'll help you out. Has to be better than interviewing Richard Simmons, I think. Richie says. So it's just a very interesting change. From the books, they were committed from the beginning as soon as they got the phone calls and came back to basically about to leave Derry to Pennywise without doing anything in the miniseries. Just a sort of interesting altercation. Do you have any favorite Pennywise scenes? I know there's so many to choose from. I mean, like, for me, I'll just say one of my favorite ones was always when, near the end of the first part, where they're doing the hand-holding thing and Stan's doing his Boy Scout chant. And then all of a sudden, like, he just hears a whisper, Stanley boy. And then he looks over and Pennywise has him. I mean, that scene, when I was a kid, that scene terrified the shit out of me. It's such a great scene.
Yeah. The majority of the Pennywise sightings in part 1, most of them stand out to me, like the Eddie shower scene, the one that you just mentioned there. But I think if I had to pick one out of all of them, probably the first one that's before all the flashbacks, the laundry sheets. I think that's just a scene where the way it's filmed is just so creepy, and you're seeing this little girl who we don't see anything, but clearly she's been eaten by this clown. You don't even see what remains are left, but obviously there are some remains, because the mother sees something when she goes outside. And that one really stands out to me the most, I think.
I think one of the more amusing ones, one that always cracked me up, which I sort of alluded to earlier, was in the second part when Richie goes to the library and Pennywise is just cracking jokes, like just shouting jokes, and Richie's the only one who can hear it. And he's just screaming at that poor librarian, tell Mike Allen. That scene, I don't know, that just cracks me up. Just Pennywise, Tim Curry up this, screaming hideously lame jokes, and such a and the balloons, throwing blood everywhere. That's just a great scene.
Well, I didn't quite enjoy as much the scenes where Pennywise is turned into the Wolfman for Richie, so, I mean, the clown itself is more terrifying in my opinion.
Is the Wolfman more terrifying than the spider,
though?
Question for the ages.
If I was actually in that situation, I would probably say the spider, but they're both done fairly poorly, in my opinion. Well, the spider's probably even more sillier, looking at it through the lens of a movie, but if you're actually there in that situation, I'd probably be more scared of a spider than a wolf man.
I think the main problem with the end was, at the end of the first part, Artie had a pretty kick-ass line, this is Badri acid, you slime. And the second part is just, this is Badri acid, now you disappear. I mean, it's not very inspired, so I suspect that's mostly Artie's fault.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you go be a virgin for that long.
Well, I can't help you there, buddy.
Yeah.
I will say, the actor who played Richie, Harry Anderson, as an adult, that has to be, and along with John Ritter as Ban, those two characters I thought worked really well together. So while I generally like the kids' performances more, aside from maybe Emily Perkins who does Beverly, there are some really decent actors as adults. It's just the story itself isn't nearly as enthralling.
They are doing a huge documentary on this movie with tons of behind-the-scenes footage that is actually coming out. I don't know if it's later this year or sometime next year. I contributed to, I think it was a Kickstarter campaign for it, so I will get a Blu-ray of it when they finally finish everything. And it's got Tim Curry doing an interview for it, and I don't think he's ever really sat down and done a proper interview for it before. And even though his health has since taken a downturn, which would have been nice to get an interview with him about it back when he was a lot younger, but still, getting it now is going to be very interesting. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's in my top 3. So it comes as no surprise that I'm giving it a 10 out of 10, even though I don't think the second half works nearly as well as the first half. Overall, I still really enjoy it, especially because it's one of those few movies that actually gives me goosebumps, even to this day. So a lot of that has to do with the music, the Pennywise encounters. They all stand out rather well. There's only a few of them that don't work as well as the others, and Tim Curry's performance it's just one of the best performances that I've seen for a character in a movie.
Yeah, like I said, this is a difficult one for me. I have such a history with this movie, as many horror fans do. So I can't, entirely discount what it did for me when I was younger. Ultimately, I would give the movie slightly below average, 6.5 out of 10, rounded up to a 7. There's so many great things about it, and like I said, it really shaped my love for the genre. But at the same time, there's there's some really corny lines. It's just the whole, when they're kids, he just, how do you know? Oh, he just does. Oh, he just does. It's just a bit much, and leading into the It's Alright song. And when they're adults, I was talking about this earlier, but that line, why does it hate? Why is it so mean? That line, I quote that line all the time nowadays, because it's just such it's not a great delivery, it's just not great dialogue. But so there's some things that are problematic. I wish they could throw in more things in the book. I think if you see this when you're younger, though, there's always going to be a nostalgic impression. So even though I did rate it slightly below average, I definitely do not undervalue the importance of this miniseries. Last up, we have the 1988 remake of The Blob. The original Blob came out in 1958, so they sort of updated it with a much more, 80s feel. Well, it's an 80s movie, so of course it's going to have an 80s feel. Story is pretty much the same as the first one. Mysterious object flies into Earth, which contains a blob. It's a pink gelatinish thing that, absorbs people, takes the skin off, decimates bodies in very violent and often gory ways. And there's a bunch of teens who run into this. And I'll be honest, I don't think that most of the teens matter. And they run into this, and throughout the movie they try to get people to believe them, and they try to investigate. Then there's toward the end, 40 minutes from the end, Then we have like sort of a government agency. Well, I don't know if you even know of the government, but they come in and try to clean up this quote unquote contamination. And this sort of like almost a conspiracy theory toward the end. Almost like the Crazies, actually, if you guys remember that George A. Romero movie from the 70s. But there's a lot of interesting things in the movie. It's definitely a decent and decently enjoyable movie. I suspect the high point for many people is probably going to be the special effects, which are really, really good. I'd actually seen this movie once before, like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, and I didn't care for it. But the special effects are undeniably pretty fantastic. I don't know, I think it's a really enjoyable, it's not necessarily an amazing movie, but there's some decent actors and actresses, and I think it's a good popcorn flick. Just throw it in a DVD player or Blu-ray if you're a more fancy guy. Throw it in for an hour and a half, have a fun time. And a lot of it may not be amazing, but I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I think the effects in it are, for the most part, really good too. Just to give you some insight as to my first experience with this movie, I don't know exactly what age I was, but I was quite young when I watched it. Kind of in the early to mid-90s I watched it. And I was watching it and recording it off TV. I'm not sure why I didn't watch it when it was actually on TV itself. I don't know if maybe my parents said it's bedtime, you know. But anyways, I was recording it off TV, commercials and everything. And to my knowledge, I don't think it really had anything cut out either, so that was good. But the one problem was that whatever tape that I used and started recording from, I didn't get to see everything because the tape ran out kind of 2/3 of the way through the movie. The tape ran out during that scene where they're in the sewer, which is actually quite a really good, scary scene in the movie, I think. It was just after the one kid gets dragged under the water, and then they're kind of left wondering, you know, is he dead? What's happened? So, and that's where the tape ended for me.
It's a downbeat ending.
Yeah. But from that, and I don't know if this plays into it, but from that point onward throughout the movie, which I've obviously seen since because I've got it on DVD and now Blu-ray, from that point onward, I don't enjoy the movie as much as the first 2/3 of the movie. I think when you see the Blob and it's become this huge thing, it's suddenly lost that element, I guess, of surprise. Because you see, even when it's quite big in the sewer, because it's under the water, you don't know exactly where it is, when it's going to pop up or anything. But once it gets to the point where, you know, everyone's barricading themselves in that place and it's so huge, it kind of loses that surprise factor to its attacks on everyone. And I didn't necessarily enjoy so much the sci-fi aspect of it with the contamination team and all that. But everything else about the movie is really, really good. The kill scenes in those first 2/3 of the movie are really good. Especially that one, the character Paul, where he gets covered.
Yes, yeah.
You see him in the hallway kind of with his arm out, and that's really cool. That one really stood out to me. So throughout the first 2/3 of the movie, really, really enjoyed it. And yeah, it just loses a bit of steam for me in that final third of the movie after they're out of the sewer.
Yeah, I guess it's important for me to mention that much like how it was influential for me loving the horror genre, I own the original Blob, the 1958 version of the Blob on VHS, and when I was a kid, I watched it so many times. You know, being a late 50s movie, it's actually really decent. Well, of course, I'm probably biased, but I don't know, it's a movie that I saw all the time when I was a kid, and when I finally, you know, got to the remake, I just wasn't expecting that much, mainly because I didn't think anything could be nearly as good as the Blob. It's worth mentioning that the Blob, much like some other really popular 80s remakes that came out, such as The Thing, which a lot of people consider one of the best horror movies ever made, and there's also Jeff Goldblum's The Fly. For all three movies, I actually think the originals are better. Of course, I always expect hate for treats sent my way. I'm okay with that. The Blob, the remake of The Blob is still a really enjoyable, really fun movie. Like Chucky says, the first 2/3 are fantastic. I agree it loses steam toward the end. I don't know if I have exactly the same reasons, but I certainly do feel that once the monster becomes this really big, giant thing, it doesn't work as well. I don't know, I think part of the appeal was that it just sucking people through like these small pipes and stuff. I mean, there's some really painful looking scenes in this movie, and it helps that the special effects are really dang good. I also have to say the ending, like the last scene. I don't know if it's like a plot twist, but that scene, I sort of liked aspects of it, but overall it didn't really do much for me.
I guess it's just, I'm not a huge sci-fi guy. I'm not sure if you are, but it does become, like, it starts out like a horror movie, then it starts becoming more and more sci-fi as it moves along. And I think that's, for me, a part of the reason why it does trail off a little bit as it gets towards its conclusion.
One thing I also want to throw in there, and I know I'm always like bringing up actors, but a lot of times it doesn't necessarily change the movie for me, but I think it's interesting to make mention of. Shawnee Smith, who is potentially best known as playing Amanda in the Saw movies, does a really good with her role, as sort of like a kick-ass cheerleader type individual. It takes a little for her to really get going, and she can be pretty naive at times, but I really liked her as the main character. Also, there's a Jeffrey DeMann, who might not be a familiar name, but he was in a really popular movie, The Green Mile. He was also in Storm of the Century, which is one of my favorite Stephen King miniseries. He was also in The Mist, another movie based off of Stephen King's story. And he's an actor who I've always enjoyed seeing. I really liked him in this movie, but he sort of has an unceremonious ending, which admittedly sort of annoyed me. I thought they could have done so much more with him, and they sort of just throw him under the bus, or should I say, throw him under the blob. So, okay, I was top now.
That was terrible.
I'm not sure why I'm so happy with that, but I mean, it's a pretty enjoyable movie. It's just some smaller things. I sort of like the whole sci-fi sort of government angle, but I don't know if they did the best job. I definitely do like that scene toward the end when when the main character, the town punk, is sort of verbally, going after the science guy, just screaming back and forth, it's not an infraction, these people are lying, and the science guy say we should just shoot this guy. It's just I don't know, I really like that scene. I always like seeing fascist governments get revealed to the public, so I don't know. I think the movie has a lot going for it. There were some angles I didn't think worked out that well. But it's, like I said at the beginning, it's definitely a fun movie. It may not be a perfect movie, but I do know a lot of people out there enjoy it, and I think they have a lot of reason to.
Yeah, I think it could have done without an explanation as to where it came from or what it is. I think if they cut out, that it's a man-made experimental thing, if it was just simply this thing that fell to the earth from outer space or wherever, and it's killing people and they have to figure out how to stop it, and just leave it at that I would have been happy with that.
Yeah, it's interesting because that, to me, that seems like a sort of like a post-2000s quote-unquote plot twist. I mean, I see that all the time now in horror movies, where, it was a man-made, like in half the zombie movies that come out, it's a man-made disease gone wild. I think one of the reasons they did that is to sort of differentiate that from the original 50s movie, where the 50s movie is just an alien, and here they were to, especially since this is going on during the Cold War, and I know there were references made to, hey, we're gonna have the ultimate weapon against the Russians. I think it's really a product of its time in that element. I mean, this is only 4 years after Raw Down came out, and I don't know if you've seen Raw Down, but that was probably one of the biggest pieces of American propaganda that exists. So, I don't laugh about it, I know why they threw it in. I feel like it's really a product of our time. I agree that the last third of the movie is not as good, but I don't know if it necessarily, at least for me, I don't think it takes away as much enjoyment as it might for you.
I mean, it doesn't take away a lot of enjoyment. I just think it's the weakest part of the movie.
Yeah, and like I said, I did it, when I first saw it, I didn't go in expecting much, but I can unabashedly say I think it's an enjoyable movie, and I sort of regret my closed-mindedness when I was about a child, so luckily I've learned from my mistakes. It's turned out as good as the 50s movie, but it's a decent movie.
I did watch the 50s version, actually quite young, because my dad, The Blob is one of those things that he watched when, I don't know what age he was, but obviously when he was a lot younger, before I was born. I think I watched the remake first, but I watched the original probably not long after, when I was still quite a young child, so him watching that with me is, how do I want to put this? My brother and father had a lot more same interests than what I had with my father. So, scary movies is probably one of the very few same interests that we had. So,
when it comes down to it, I think The Blob's an enjoyable remake. It's certainly really gory. It has some great special effects, some decent performances, despite some of the actors not having great plot lines. I think there's a lot going for it, and I think there's a reason that quite a few people enjoy it. It's not my first pick for a monster movie. I'm thinking about my top 50 80s horror movies, and I'm almost positive this would not make my top 50. I mean, to be fair, the 80s was such a prolific decade. So many great 80s horror movies, but I mean, I just don't have the same, I guess, background with The Blob, and especially my very strong nostalgic feelings for the original sort of color my view. Ultimately, I would call the remake a pretty good movie. I give it an 8 out of 10. Definitely recommend it, and it's by no means a movie I would say you should stay away from. It just, as good as it is, I just don't think it can beat my nostalgic feelings for the original.
Like I said, I saw this movie quite young, and I think seeing a movie, especially an 80s movie, when you're that young and enjoying it, definitely helps to lend itself to a slightly higher rating than what I might have given it had I seen it 10, 20 years later. I also give the movie an 8 out of 10. I really enjoy it. It's got some really cool kill scenes, and the creature itself is quite interesting until they over-explain it as the movie concludes. But no, I really enjoyed a lot of the surprising kills earlier in the movie when the Blob is a lot smaller.
So with those 5 movies talked about, any interesting things coming out on your side, Chucky? Any movies you're excited for?
Well, as we all know, Child's Play, the remake, is coming out, so I will be seeing that on Thursday, which I believe is Wednesday in the US, so haha, I get to see it before a lot of other people.
Now, unfortunately, I also anticipate seeing that movie, so once we do, we can talk about that. Should be a fun time. Even if the movie's not great, at least we can talk about them for the first time since we've done the show, a movie that came out like past 2015.
But I did also see Brightburn recently. I'm not sure if that's still playing in the theaters over there. It's kind of at the end of its run here. But surprisingly better than I thought it was going to be. Definitely a lot more gruesome type scenes than I had anticipated going in. I thought it'd be more of like a anti-superhero movie with horror themes, but it is actually more of a horror movie with anti-superhero themes.
And that's one that I've seen a lot of positive reviews for that one online. No, I've seen some more mixed things, but most of what I see is much along the same lines. They anticipated something not as good as they actually got. So I've not seen it, and much like you, it's not something I think I would enjoy. But if I do see it, within the next 15 to 25 years, I'm sure it will probably be better than what I expect.
Low expectations also helps, because my wife was the one who wanted to really see it, and I was like, I'll watch it, but I'm not that interested in it. And the funny thing is, I think I ended up enjoying it slightly more than she did.
Well, at least she has Subspecies to fall back on.